Welcome to CT's Histories, where we'll be discussing historical shooting, sewing, crafts, and learning in general. This video series is part of Corey's trading posts on Facebook and CT's Paperclad's paper models. More about that later. I started sewing historic clothing in 1989 when I got into Civil War reenacting, and by the 1990s I was doing sewing and researching for multiple time periods. Here's an example of a Napoleonic coat I made for my buddy Mike. And I've done plenty of Civil War stuff over the years. In 1989, I got introduced to paper modeling and I loved it. But I noticed there was a lack of Confederate ironclads, or really any ironclads, available. So I set to work on producing these kind of models. For today's topic, we're going to talk about a Confederate vest, a homespun style of vest. This vest represents the typical homespun style of clothing worn by many Confederate officers and men. This is not necessarily clothing that was made from home and then sent to the troops on the front line. Of course, that did happen. But it also, the officers and men would, from time to time, be able to get their hands on military style fabric or other fabric that they could purchase and then pay a private tailor to produce the type of fabric that they wanted. This happened with both uniforms as well as with the small clothes or the vests of the time period. This particular vest is made out of a jean wool fabric. You can look that up online. Jean wool or jean cotton wool blend was a mainstay of the Confederate uniforms. And also, prior to the war, it was a very common fabric across the South. This vest also uses pre-war Union eye buttons or eagle buttons. They were pretty standard, and the South had thousands of these at the start of the war. Also, you'll note the top stitching. This particular vest has over 500 inches of top stitching. It is all hand done. The internal seams or the hidden seams are done by sewing machine. However, all of the exposed stitching, including the buttonholes, are done by hand. You'll notice that this is just a very simple buttonhole stitch, nothing fancy, and I went with about 6 stitches per inch for the top stitching. Here's a close-up of the collar. You'll note more of that top stitching. Everything is secured pretty well. This style of vest would wear a long time. It would last a long time. And when you had limited clothing supply, this is what you would want if you had an option. You'll notice the collar. The collar has severe curves on it. This was common. However, there was no actual regulation style military vest back then, so it was up to the individual purchaser. Sometimes the collars were more squared off, and sometimes they were rather angular or lower. Here's an extreme close-up of the inside of the vest. You'll note the jean wool facing and the top stitching that secures it, and then you'll notice the Ozenberg lining. Now this lining is a padded lining, a quilted lining, and you'll notice the top stitching that goes through that padding to quilt it. This gave the vest a more muscular appearance to the wearer. This gave longer lasting. It made it look nice. Here's another shot of that inside lining. You'll note the facing again, and you'll note too that there is actually a bottom facing on this vest. The bottom facing is actually spliced. You run into this on a lot of period clothing where the facing pieces are spliced. This was, of course, to save on fabric. You'll also note that the Ozenberg lining has an internal pocket. This was a special request from my friend that I made this for. He needed some place to put his modern day credit cards and IDs and so forth, and it worked out well. However, it will be noted that on period clothing there were all kinds of pockets. Again, these were not regulation clothes. These were quote unquote military cut or fashion, but they were made by individual tailors. Okay, now you can see on this picture the buttonholes, that top stitching, and the buttons and the general cut of the collar. It looks at first glance like I made a mistake and made the right hand side of the vest longer than the buttonhole side or the left hand side. In fact, I cut this way on purpose. A lot of historic clothing, for some reason, men's clothing, was cut slightly lopsided. An extreme example of that, of course, is on the Atlanta Depot jackets, where the center line of the jacket was the center line of the body and the buttons were very offset. In this case, I made the right hand side of the vest just a little longer than the left to give better button placement. I'm guess that this was produced that way back then so that they would have the option of moving those buttons closer to the edge or further away to tighten up the fit a little bit over time or loosen it without messing up the general look when the wearer was wearing it. And the overall look of the vest. Again, you'll note too that the center line of the vest is actually curved slightly. Some vests of the period, as well as jackets, had a severe curve to the front. It was just the style. It was how you were expected to look. This vest has a slight curve, and again, you'll note that top stitching. You'll note the top stitching on the 3 pockets, and you'll note that the top stitching is also around the armholes. Not all vests had this much top stitching, but some pieces of clothing were heavily top stitched. It did help it stay flat, and it did help it wear longer. This vest has the typical 3 pockets, and you'll note the darts. Not all period vests had darts, but many certainly did by this time period. And a close-up of one of the pockets. You'll note the dart seam going in behind it. These pockets were basically, you could keep your pocket watch in it, you could keep small change in it. They were not large pockets. But you'll note the top stitching, and you'll note that this is called a pocket welt, where it's folded up. If you reverse the way that this welt was put on, you would have a pocket flap. It just depends on how you wanted to sew it. And welts were increasingly popular in the 19th century as opposed to flaps from the earlier period. And an overall shot of the back. You'll note that the back is secured or tightened with a simple strap, and this belt or strap goes through a Japan roller buckle, very popular during the time period. These buckles were also found on the backs of trousers as well. You'll note again that top stitching, and you'll note that the belt itself is also top stitched. And here you'll note the close-up of that belt with that roller buckle. And you'll note the brown color of the fabric. It is a polished cotton. Many vests use black fabric, many vests use brown. Some vests use the simple Ossenberg that the lining is made out of. In this case, my friend wanted to go with the brown polished cotton. And you'll note the back of the collar again with the top stitching, and you'll see how just barely the fronts of the vest come over the shoulder line. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but they actually, that shoulder seam is not on the top of the shoulder. It's actually towards the back, just like a lot of jackets were made back then. It prevented that seam from wearing out on the tops of the shoulder where the weight of the coat was. And another look at the three pockets. The top pocket, I have no idea. Again, pocket watch possibly. It is quite small. And the 2 lower pockets are basically very similar to vests today in their size. So there you have it, one Confederate homespun style vests. I will say again that this was my attempt at reproducing one. If you find fault in it or think that something's not quite right, let me know. But overall, this is my version of a private purchase or tailor-made vest during the Civil War time period. Thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this, you can catch up with me at Corey's Trading Post on Facebook. And of course, you can also go to Ben Tart's website and purchase some of your own jean fabric if you'd like to give this style of clothing a try. If you're into model building and would like to try some of these paper models, feel free to check out www.ecardmodels.com. I have models on there. It's a site that's been around for a long time, and just recently it's being remade. So not all of our models are back online yet, but they are coming. You can also check out www.papermodelers.com. There are a lot of free models in the download section, and the people there are wonderful and would give you all kinds of advice. And of course, you can check out Models and More website. They have some of my free models on there, and they also have models from a variety of other designers. So go ahead and check them out. Thank you.